My son-in-law had no idea that I owned the multi-billion-dollar company where he worked as chief executive officer. He only saw me as a tired old man living in a dusty farmhouse. One evening, he and my daughter invited me to an upscale dinner with his wealthy parents. I thought they wanted to catch up. I sat there in my faded flannel shirt, enduring their silent judgments, waiting to see how they would treat a simple man. Then he slid a thick envelope across the table, offering me money to disappear. 5 minutes later, I walked out and overheard a phone call that shattered everything. I thought I knew about my family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. The Michelin star restaurant in downtown Chicago was the kind of place where a single steak cost more than what a farmhand makes in a week. I sat stiffly, my faded red flannel shirt and calloused hands out of place among the silk suits. Across from me sat Victor Lawson, my son-in-law, swirling expensive red wine. Next to him was my daughter Rachel, wearing a diamond necklace. Victor's parents, dripping in old money arrogance, sat opposite. His mother glared at my scuffed work boots, wrinkling her nose as if the smell of fresh soil had ruined her truffle soup. I kept my mouth shut, eating in silence, trying to be a good father. Victor cleared his throat. He reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a thick white envelope, and slid it slowly across the linen tablecloth. It stopped by my glass. "What is this, Victor?" I asked. He offered a smooth, practiced smile. "Go ahead and open it, Richard." I pulled out a cashier's check. The number printed on it was $10,000. I stared at the zeros, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Victor leaned forward. "As you know, the 10th anniversary gala for Apex Innovations is next Friday. It is going to be the biggest corporate event of the year. The press and all our major shareholders will be there. We know how much you hate crowds, Richard. An event like this would just exhaust you." Rachel placed her perfectly manicured hand over my rough fingers. "We are just protecting your health, Dad. You have been looking tired. Victor and I thought you could use this money to book a quiet fishing resort in Florida for the week. A vacation far away from the noise, protecting my health." That was the lie they agreed upon. The truth was written on his parents' faces. They were embarrassed by me. I was a dirty farmer who would make the hotshot executive look bad in front of the elite shareholders. The bitter irony almost made me laugh. Shareholders. 10 years ago, when my beautiful wife Patricia passed away, grief nearly destroyed me. I realized money could not buy back a single day with her. So I took my entire industrial empire, everything I built over 40 years, and transferred it into an anonymous legal entity called the Horizon Trust. I bought 50 acres of farmland and decided to live out my remaining years in peace. Patricia and I did not inherit our wealth. We forged it in the scorching heat of unventilated warehouses during the late 1970s. In those early days, my hands were permanently stained black with machine grease, and Patricia would sit at a makeshift plywood desk until 2 in the morning, balancing our fragile ledgers by the dim light of a kerosene lamp because we could not afford electricity in the office. We ate canned soup for dinner so we could make payroll for our first 5 employees. Every single dollar this company generated was built on a foundation of our shared exhaustion, our sleepless nights, and our unwavering belief in treating our workers like extended family. We never cared about yachts or country clubs. The farm was our ultimate dream. It was the only piece of the world we wanted for ourselves, a quiet sanctuary where the air smelled of rain and pine instead of exhaust and hot asphalt. When the cancer took her, the sprawling corporate empire we had built felt like a massive empty mausoleum. The billions in the bank were nothing but useless numbers on a glowing screen, utterly incapable of buying me one more afternoon on the porch with the woman I loved. That was why I retreated. I did not step away because I was weak or because my mind was failing. I stepped away because the corporate world had lost its soul the moment Patricia took her final breath. I left the empire in the hands of the next generation, hoping they would honor the blood and sweat baked into its foundations. I foolishly believed that allowing Victor and Rachel to experience the weight of leadership would teach them humility. Instead, the sudden influx of unearned power acted like a magnifying glass, exposing the shallow, hollow core of their true character. They looked at the sacred legacy Patricia and I had bled for, and saw nothing but a limitless ATM to fund their hollow aristocratic fantasies. But I wanted to ensure Rachel was taken care of. 5 years ago, when she married Victor, I pulled strings from the shadows. I secretly instructed the board of directors at Apex Innovations to install Victor as chief executive. He believed he earned the job through sheer brilliance. He had absolutely no idea that the quiet flannel-wearing old man he mocked was the 100% owner of the company he ran. I had built Apex Innovations from a single dusty warehouse into a global powerhouse. I knew every gear, every contract, and the true value of loyalty. When I handed the keys over through the trust, I assumed Victor would run it with the same respect. I was wrong. And now he was using my own company's money to bribe me to disappear. I folded the check and placed it back on the table. I appreciate the thought, I said, keeping my voice level. But I do not need a vacation. I will just stay home next week. You do not have to worry about me showing up and ruining your night. Victor's jaw tightened, but he recovered his fake smile. Are you sure, Richard? It is an all-expenses-paid trip. I am sure, I replied, standing up. Thank you for the dinner. I am heading back to the farm. Rachel stood up, panicked. Dad, wait. I am full, sweetie. I turned and walked out, ignoring the relieved sighs from Victor's parents. The crisp night air hit my face in the parking lot. I had accepted long ago that Victor was a greedy man, but seeing Rachel treat me like a nuisance broke my heart. I walked toward my beat-up 2012 Chevy Silverado parked in the far corner away from the luxury vehicles. As I approached my truck, I heard a voice echoing through the quiet garage. I stepped behind a concrete pillar. About 50 feet away, Victor was pacing next to his brand-new Porsche. He held his phone to his ear, his voice sharp and aggressive, completely different from the smooth tone he used inside. I do not care what the union says, Victor barked. Just fire the 400 assembly workers at the South plant on Monday morning. Tell them it is restructuring. And listen to me carefully. Reroute their severance packages into the offshore account in the Caymans. I need that cash liquid before the gala on Friday. My blood ran cold. 400 workers. Men and women who had families depending on those jobs. He was stealing their severance. The voice on the line asked a question, and Victor let out a cruel laugh. Do not worry about the old man, Victor sneered. He did not take the bribe to leave town, but it does not matter. He is completely clueless. Rachel is going over to his farm tomorrow morning with the paperwork. She told him it was just life insurance forms. Once that idiot signs the bottom line, we will have full legal control over his property and medical rights. The land will be ours by Wednesday. I stood frozen, gripping my truck keys so hard the metal dug into my palm. This was not just about hiding an embarrassing father-in-law from the press. My daughter and her husband were orchestrating massive corporate fraud, destroying innocent workers' lives. Worse, they were plotting to steal my home and strip away my legal rights. They thought I was a naive, exhausted old farmer who would blindly sign whatever his daughter put in front of him. They thought they held all the cards. They assumed my silence at the dinner table was weakness. They mistook my simple clothes for simple-mindedness. They forgot that you do not build a multi-billion-dollar empire by being soft. You build it by seeing the angles other men miss, by striking only when the trap is perfectly set. I waited until Victor sped out of the parking lot before I stepped out from the shadows. I climbed into this cab of my Silverado and gripped the steering wheel. I did not feel like a tired old man anymore. The grief evaporated, replaced by a burning clarity. I had spent 10 years hiding from the ruthless corporate world I had dominated for decades. But if my son-in-law wanted to play a game of deception, if he wanted to destroy the company I built and use my own daughter to steal my life, he was about to learn a very hard lesson. He was about to find out exactly who Richard Caldwell really was. The morning sun hit the dusty porch of my farmhouse. Normally, this was the most peaceful part of my day. But today, the silence felt incredibly heavy. My coffee had gone cold. I had not slept a single wink. Every time I closed my eye, I heard Victor's cruel voice echoing in the parking lot. I heard him talking about firing 400 innocent people. I heard him talking about stealing my land. But the part that kept twisting the knife in my chest was not Victor. It was Rachel, my own daughter. She was supposed to come over this morning. Victor had said she was bringing paperwork that I was clueless and would just sign whatever she put in front of me. I wanted to believe my daughter was innocent. But 40 years in the corporate world had taught me that hope was a dangerous thing when it blinded you to the truth. I heard tires crunching on the gravel driveway. Rachel's silver Mercedes pulled up next to my old Silverado. I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to stop trembling. I stood up slowly, deliberately, stooping my shoulders a bit more than usual to play the part they expected. Rachel stepped out of her car. Her hair was styled and she carried a woven basket. She walked up the wooden steps with a bright, warm smile. "Good morning, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I brought you something special." She lifted the cloth. It was a blueberry pie. Patricia's recipe. My late wife used to make that exact pie every Sunday. Using her dead mother's recipe to manipulate me was a new low. "Oh, sweetie," I said, keeping my voice soft. "You really did not have to do that." "I just wanted to check on you after last night," she replied. "You seemed exhausted at dinner. Victor and I were worried about you driving back here in the dark." I managed a weak chuckle. "I am fine, Rachel. Just an old man who gets tired easily." She nodded sympathetically. "Let us go inside, Dad. I will make you a fresh pot of coffee." I followed her into the kitchen. I watched her move around, chatting casually. It was a flawlessly executed performance. If I had not stood in the shadows of that parking garage 12 hours ago, I would have believed every single word. But now every smile felt like a trap. She poured the steaming black coffee into my ceramic mug. Then she reached into her designer leather tote bag. "Oh, before I forget," she said casually, "I brought some boring paperwork for you to look at." She pulled out a thick stack of papers and smoothed them out on the table right next to my mug. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "Just routine stuff," she said. "It is the renewal for your life insurance policy. The broker called yesterday. He said if you do not sign today, your coverage might lapse. You know how those corporate insurance guys are. Always rushing things." She handed me a silver pen. "Just sign right there at the bottom, Dad. And on the back page, too." I highlighted the lines in yellow so you do not have to read through all that dense legal jargon. My gut screamed. In 40 years of negotiating corporate mergers, I had learned one absolute rule. Never trust someone who tells you not to read the fine print. And never sign a document without reading the bottom of the last page. That is where they hide the poison. I looked at the top page. It did look like a standard insurance form, but the stack was too thick. There were at least 15 pages underneath it. I reached for the pen with a trembling hand. I needed to see what was beneath that top page. But if I flipped through the document, she would get suspicious. I had to create a distraction. I had to ruin the paperwork so she would have to separate the pages. "Oh, my reading glasses," I mumbled, patting my chest. "I think I left them in the living room. Let me just grab my coffee first." I reached for the heavy ceramic mug. As my fingers brushed the handle, I intentionally jerked my elbow inward. My forearm slammed hard into the side of the mug. The hot coffee violently spilled across the table, splashing directly onto the thick stack of documents. Rachel shrieked and jumped back. "Dad, watch out!" I gasped, playing the part of the clumsy old man perfectly. Oh, I am so sorry, Rachel. My hands, they just give out sometimes. Let me get a towel. I grabbed a dish towel and frantically wiped the table deliberately, smearing the dark coffee deeper into the paper. Rachel grabbed the soaking wet stack, her face flushed with sudden panic, and tried to shake the liquid off. Dad, stop rubbing it, she snapped. You are ruining the ink. As she peeled the wet, sticky pages apart, to salvage them, the heavy top pages folded downward. For 3 agonizing seconds, the final page was completely exposed to my line of sight. The yellow highlighter mark was exactly where she said it would be. But my eyes darted to the bold black letters printed at the very top of that page. It did not say life insurance renewal. The heading read, Full Durable Power of Attorney and Asset Transfer Agreement. The air in my lungs vanished. The betrayal hit me harder than any physical blow. This document would grant Victor and Rachel absolute legal control over my finances, medical decisions, and property. It was a legal execution. With one stroke of a pen, my own daughter was trying to strip away my legal rights, steal my farm, and erase my freedom. I quickly looked down, pretending I had not seen a thing. I continued wiping the table with trembling hands. I am so sorry, sweetie, I stammered. I am just a clumsy old fool. I ruined your important papers. Rachel stared at the dripping documents. The ink was bleeding, rendering the signature lines completely useless. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes to regain her composure. When she opened them, the fake smile was back. It is okay, Dad, she said softly. It was an accident. Do not worry about it. What about the insurance, I asked. Will I lose my coverage? No, she forced a laugh. I will just go back to the broker and print a clean copy. I will bring it back tomorrow morning. You just get some rest today, okay? I nodded slowly, letting my shoulders slump. Thank you, Rachel. I will be ready to sign tomorrow. I promise. She packed the ruined documents back into her expensive bag, grabbed her keys, and kissed me on the cheek. Her perfume smelled like lavender, but all I could sense was venom. I will see you tomorrow, Dad. I watched from the kitchen window as she marched back to her car. Her steps were fast and angry. The moment her silver Mercedes disappeared down the dirt road, my trembling act vanished. My posture straightened. My hands stopped shaking. I looked at the blueberry pie sitting on the counter. I picked up the entire basket and threw it directly into the trash can. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a senile ghost waiting to fade away. Tomorrow, they were coming back to steal my life. But I was not going to be here waiting for them. It was time to leave the farm. It was time to go back to the city. It was time to show Victor Lawson what happens when you try to steal from the man who built the very walls around you. I grabbed my truck keys and headed for the door. The drive from my dirt road into the towering concrete heart of downtown took exactly 45 minutes. I gripped the worn steering wheel of my old Chevy Silverado, my knuckles white, my mind replaying the bold letters on that legal document. A durable power of attorney. My own flesh and blood wanted to legally erase me. I watched the peaceful green fields fade into the rearview mirror, replaced by the cold steel of the city skyline. Soon, the massive headquarters of Apex Innovations loomed into view. It was a 50-story monument meant to my life's work. I bypassed the polished marble lobby and the smiling receptionists. I walked straight to the freight elevator, swiped an unlisted master keycard I kept hidden for a decade, and pressed the button for the subterranean levels. The elevator descended with a heavy mechanical groan. When the metal doors parted, I stepped into a highly secured corridor that most employees did not even know existed. At the end of the hall was a thick oak door. I pushed it open. Sitting behind an expansive mahogany desk was Jonathan Reed. Jonathan was 60 years old, with iron-gray hair, a sharp suit, and the piercing gaze of a man who missed absolutely nothing. He was the manager of the Horizon Trust, the legal fortress I had built to protect my wealth. He was the only living soul who knew that Richard Caldwell still owned every share of Apex Innovations. Jonathan looked up from his dual monitors. His stern face broke into sheer shock. He slowly took off his reading glasses. "Richard," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and concern. "You have not stepped foot in this building in 5 years. What is wrong?" I walked over to the heavy leather chair and sat down. "Everything is wrong, Jonathan." I leaned forward. "Victor is trying to steal my farm. He is having Rachel trick me into signing away my legal rights." Jonathan frowned, his professional demeanor instantly hardening into a cold anger. "Are you certain, Richard? We can have our legal team shred him by noon." I shook my head. "No. If we stop the paperwork, he will try another angle. He thinks he holds all the power. I heard him on the phone last night, Jonathan. He is firing 400 assembly workers on Monday and rerouting their severance pay to an offshore account in the Caymans." Jonathan stopped typing. The silence in the underground office became suffocating. "Rerouting severance packages offshore is federal fraud, Richard. If Victor is doing that, he is taking a massive risk. A man only takes a risk like that if he is desperate or planning an exit strategy. I need to know exactly what is happening inside my company. I need you to initiate a shadow audit of Victor's entire tenure as chief executive. I want to see every hidden ledger, every offshore transfer, every single financial decision he has made since I handed him the keys." Jonathan typed a complex sequence of passwords into his system, bypassing the standard executive firewalls. Because the Horizon Trust held the absolute majority voting rights, Jonathan had backdoor access to the company's deepest financial servers. The screen reflected in his glasses as lines of data began to scroll rapidly. I waited, the ticking of the grandfather clock echoing like a countdown. For 5 long minutes, Jonathan cross-referenced bank accounts and internal corporate emails. When he finally stopped, his face was pale. He slowly turned his monitor so I could see the screen. The numbers were glowing in harsh red ink. "Richard, you need to see this." Jonathan said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "It is much worse than stolen severance pay. Victor is intentionally bleeding your company dry." "Explain it to me," I said, my chest tightening. "Over the past 8 months." Jonathan began, pointing to a sharp downward curve on the graph. "Victor has been systematically tanking the stock price of Apex Innovations. He has been sabotaging our supply chain contracts, delaying product launches, and creating artificial labor disputes to drive investors away." "But why?" I asked. "Why destroy the company he runs?" "Because he is preparing it for a hostile buyout," Jonathan revealed, tapping a specific file on the screen. "As the stock price hits rock bottom, a mysterious shell company has been quietly buying up the discounted shares through proxy buyers. They are positioning themselves to swoop in and purchase the entire manufacturing division for pennies on the dollar." I stared at the name of the shell company listed on the screen. Obsidian Holdings. It was a ghost entity, completely untraceable to the naked eye. He is creating a false crisis so this Obsidian Holdings can acquire the company's core assets for a fraction of their true worth. Once the buyout is complete, the new owners will liquidate the rest of the company, leaving nothing but ashes, and Victor gets a massive payout from the buyers for facilitating the destruction from the inside, I deduced. "Exactly," Jonathan confirmed. "He is burning your legacy to the ground for a golden parachute." I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the cold reality washing over me. 40 years of waking up before dawn, breathing in the scent of hot metal. I had provided health care and pensions for thousands of hardworking people. And my son-in-law was dismantling it all, trading human lives for digits in an offshore bank account. But the most painful part was the realization that my daughter was standing right beside him. "Did Rachel know about the buyout?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jonathan looked at me with deep sympathy. "I cannot be certain about the corporate sabotage, Richard. But she is the one actively securing the power of attorney over your estate. They are working together to clear the board. If you are legally incapacitated, the trust defaults to her control, giving Victor the final proxy votes He needs to approve the hostile takeover. Eliminate the founder tank, the stock fire. The workers sell the ashes and disappear. Only cold, calculating resolve remained. Jonathan, I said, my voice steady and hard as steel. Can you trace the true ownership of Obsidian Holdings? It will take some digging through international financial records. Jonathan nodded. These shell companies are designed to hide the beneficiaries behind layers of corporate veils. But with the resources of the trust, I can tear those veils down. Give me 24 hours. Do it, I commanded. I stood up, adjusting the collar of my worn flannel shirt. Victor thinks he is playing a game of chess against a blind man. But he forgot that I laid the foundation of this company with my own 2 bare hands. I know where the structural weaknesses are. I know how to bring a building down. I turned toward the heavy oak door. Find the owner of that shell company, Jonathan. When I return to the farm, I have to play the part of the frail, confused father one more time. Rachel is coming back, and I need to see exactly how far she is willing to go to bury me. The drive back to my farm was a blur of calculated thoughts. I pulled my worn Chevy Silverado into this dirt driveway, just as the sun began to dip behind the tree line. The house was quiet, exactly as I had left it. I walked into the kitchen, cleaned up the lingering mess from the spilled coffee, and sat at the wooden table. I spent the night and the entire next morning in a state of hyper-awareness. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window panes felt magnified. I was a man preparing for war inside his own home. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the crunch of gravel signaled her arrival. I looked through the faded lace curtains. Rachel's silver Mercedes was back. But this time she was not alone. The passenger door opened and a man stepped out. He looked to be in his late 40s, wearing a pristine white medical coat over a tailored charcoal suit. He carried a sleek black leather briefcase. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump forward, slowing my breathing, adjusting my posture to look fragile and exhausted. I opened the front door just as they reached the porch steps. "Hi, Dad," Rachel said, her voice dripping with that same artificial sweetness from the day before. "I hope we are not interrupting your afternoon rest. I brought someone to see you." I blinked slowly, looking at the stranger with manufactured confusion. "Who is this, sweetie?" I asked, my voice slightly raspy. Rachel stepped inside, placing a comforting hand on my arm. "This is Dr. Sterling. After you spilled the coffee yesterday, and with how forgetful you have been lately, Victor and I got really worried. We just want to make sure you are healthy. Dr. Sterling is a specialist. He is just here to do a standard cognitive test. Nothing to worry about, just a routine checkup to give us all some peace of mind." Dr. Sterling offered a warm, practiced smile. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Richard. Do not think of this as a medical exam. We are just going to have a little chat and do a few simple exercises. Shall we sit down at the table?" I nodded meekly, shuffling my feet as I led them into the kitchen. I pulled out a wooden chair and sat heavily. Dr. Sterling sat across from me, unlatching his leather briefcase. As he reached across the table to set down a notepad, his crisp white sleeve pulled back slightly. That was when I saw it. Resting on his wrist was a Patek Philippe Nautilus. It was a solid rose gold timepiece that retailed for over $50,000. My gut tightened instantly. I knew the local doctors in our rural county. They drove practical cars, worked incredibly long hours, and wore sensible, durable watches. They did not wear luxury Swiss timepieces that cost more than a family farm. This man was not a rural geriatric specialist sent by the local clinic. He was a high-priced hired gun from the city. Victor and Rachel had bought and paid for him. A cold, quiet anger settled deep in my chest. They were paying a corrupt doctor to build a fraudulent medical record. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to give them the performance of a lifetime. Dr. Sterling clicked his expensive silver pen. "Let us start with something easy, Richard. Can you tell me what today's date is? I stared at him blankly. I furrowed my brow, letting my mouth hang open slightly. I looked down at my hands, rubbing my thumbs together, as if searching for an answer, lost in a fog. Well, I stammered, my voice trembling perfectly. It is a Tuesday, I think. Maybe Wednesday. It is hard to keep track out here in the country. It is Thursday, Richard the doctor noted, his tone gently patronizing as he jotted something down on his pad. Can you tell me what year we are in? I hesitated even longer this time. 1990. No, 2000 and... I let my voice trail off into a frustrated sigh. Dr. Sterling nodded sympathetically, though I caught the subtle, triumphant glance he shot toward Rachel. Let us try something else, he said. I am going to give you 3 words. Apple, table, penny. I want you to repeat them back and remember them, because I will ask you again in a few minutes. I repeated the words slowly, intentionally mispronouncing one. Apple, table, penny. Good. Now can you count backwards from 100 by sevens? I stared at the wood grain on the table. 93, I whispered. Then 80. 85. I stopped shaking my head and closing my eyes. I am sorry, doctor. My mind just feels so cloudy today. It is perfectly fine, Richard, he assured me, making another lengthy note. Let us try drawing. I want you to draw the face of a clock and place the hands to show 10 minutes past 11. He pushed a blank piece of paper toward me. I picked up the pen with a shaky grip. I deliberately drew a lopsided circle. I bunched the numbers together on one side, completely ignoring the left half of the page. I drew 2 mismatched lines pointing in the wrong directions. When I pushed the paper back, it looked exactly like the erratic scribbles of a mind slipping into severe dementia. The doctor looked at the paper, then gave Rachel a solemn, definitive nod. I think we have seen enough for today, he said, packing his briefcase. You did very well, Richard. You just rest now. Rachel leaned over and kissed my forehead. I will walk the doctor out, Dad. I will be right back. I nodded, staring vacantly at the table. The moment the front door clicked shut, the vacant stare vanished. I stood up swiftly and silently. I moved to the living room window, which I had intentionally left cracked open an inch that morning. I pressed my back against the wall and listened. They were standing on the porch, their voices carrying clearly through the crisp afternoon air. The performance was over. The truth was about to be spoken. He is deteriorating much faster than I anticipated, Rachel said, feigning a sigh. But her voice lacked any real sorrow. The doctor chuckled a low, cynical sound. He is completely gone, Mrs. Lawson. The dementia diagnosis is signed and official. He is legally incapacitated as of this moment. I held my breath, waiting for the final blow. Rachel's voice grew sharp and businesslike. And the facility? Is everything arranged? Everything is confirmed, the doctor replied. With this signed diagnosis and your power of attorney, you have full medical proxy. You can commit him to the Sunset Pines facility by Friday morning. They have a secured memory care ward. He will not be allowed any outside contact without your explicit permission. Excellent, Rachel said smoothly. The balance will be wired to your offshore account tonight. I slid down the wall, sitting on the floor. My own daughter purchased my life sentence. The realization threatened to crush me. I sat in the quiet of my farmhouse, listening to the wind. I spent my life trying to build a safe world for Rachel. I stepped down from the company I founded to ensure her husband had a prestigious career. Her response to my devotion was paying a corrupt doctor to lock me inside a memory care ward by Friday. I allowed myself exactly 10 minutes to grieve the daughter I knew. When those 10 minutes were up, the sorrow vanished. It was replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I was not going to spend my days staring at padded walls. I was going to tear Victor Lawson down to his foundations. Jonathan was tracing the digital footprints of Obsidian Holdings, the shell company Victor used to launch the hostile takeover. But digital trails could be contested in court. High-priced lawyers could argue systems were hacked. I needed undeniable physical proof. I knew Victor. He was an arrogant man, and arrogant men always keep a trophy of their crimes. I was certain he kept a secondary laptop hidden in his office at Apex Innovations. I needed to get onto the executive floor tonight. I walked to the hall closet and pulled down a plastic storage bin. Inside, beneath old photo albums, was a faded gray canvas uniform. It was the standard issue janitor outfit we used at Apex in the late 1990s. I kept it as a reminder of the days when I used to sweep factory floors myself to save money. I slipped the gray shirt over my shoulders and fastened the matching trousers. The fabric was stiff, but it fit perfectly. I opened a small wooden lockbox on my desk. Inside sat a thick black plastic keycard. When I designed the security architecture for the new Apex skyscraper, 20 years ago, I programmed a master override keycard. It was hard-coded into this building's mainframe, meaning no system update could ever erase it. Only the founder possessed it. I drove my Silverado to the city under the cover of darkness. The streets were deserted. It was 1 o'clock in the morning when I pulled into the dark alleyway behind the towering glass structure of Apex Innovations. I parked next to commercial dumpsters. I walked up to the heavy steel service door, my heart beating in a steady rhythm. I swiped the black card against the scanner. A green light flashed and the magnetic lock disengaged with a click. I stepped inside the loading dock. The air was cool. I walked silently to the utility room, grabbed a yellow mop bucket on wheels, and filled it with soapy water. I tossed a mop inside and pushed the cart toward the service elevator. I kept my head down the brim of my faded gray cap pulled low over my eyes. I pressed the button for the 50th floor. The elevator hummed as it climbed higher into the night sky. When the doors slid open, the hallway was bathed in dim lighting. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps. I pushed the yellow bucket down the corridor, the squeaky wheels providing perfect cover noise. I was just an invisible night shift worker doing a thankless job. As I approached the heavy double doors of the chief executive office, the handle suddenly turned. I froze. I immediately dunked the mop into the soapy water and began swishing it across the marble tiles just outside the doorway, keeping my back slightly turned. The doors pushed open. Victor walked out. But he was not alone. A woman was hanging off his arm. She was wearing a sleek black dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled even at 1 in the morning. I recognized her instantly. It was Sarah Jenkins, the chief financial officer of Apex Innovations. She leaned into Victor, tracing a finger along the lapel of his expensive suit. Her laughter echoed in the hallway, sharp and conspiratorial. They stopped right in front of the elevator. I was mopping the floor, just inches away from their expensive shoes. I kept my head down, my movements slow and rhythmic. To them, I was just part of the furniture. I was a ghost pushing a mop entirely unworthy of their attention. "Is everything ready for the board meeting?" Sarah asked, her voice hushed but completely audible. Victor smirked, pulling her closer. "Everything is perfect. The stock is tanking right on schedule. The shareholders are terrified. When I announce massive layoffs at the gala on Friday, the panic will be complete. Obsidian Holdings will swoop in, buy the manufacturing division for pocket change, and the board will thank me." Sarah giggled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And what about your lovely wife? Is she still playing her part in this little drama?" Victor let out a cold, dismissive laugh that chilled me to the bone. "Oh, Rachel is the most useful idiot I have ever met," he sneered. "She actually thinks she is securing her future. Once we dump the old man in the asylum on Friday, Rachel gets the farm. With my name on the property deeds through the marriage, I control the land." He paused, kissing the side of Sarah's neck. "Then I will divorce her, take the land in the settlement, and we fly to the Bahamas. Obsidian Holdings gets the lithium under the farm. We get $100 million, and Rachel gets nothing but a crazy father in a lockdown ward." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. I dragged the wet mop across the floor. My hands gripped the wooden handle tightly. The scale of Victor's evil was staggering. I was not just destroying my company and stealing my land. He was entirely playing my daughter. Rachel sold her soul to secure a future with a man planning to throw her away the moment the ink dried on the settlement papers. The elevator chimed. The polished steel doors slid open. Victor and Sarah stepped inside, completely oblivious to the man in the gray uniform, standing just 3 feet away. "I cannot wait for Friday," Sarah purred as the doors began to close. "Neither can I," Victor replied, his smug face disappearing behind the metal doors. The hallway fell silent again. The only sound was the faint dripping of soapy water from my mop. I stood up and pushed the brim of my cap back. I stared at the closed elevator doors, processing the venom I had witnessed. My daughter made her choice. She chose greed over family. She chose Victor over her father. For that, she would face the consequences of her actions. But Victor was the architect of this nightmare. I turned away from this elevator and looked at the double doors leading into the chief executive suite. He changed the electronic keypads, but I did not need a passcode. I built the room. I pushed my cleaning cart aside and walked up to the doorway. It was time to find the evidence. It was time to destroy Victor Lawson. I stepped up to the imposing double doors of the chief executive corner suite. The brass handles felt cold and unyielding beneath the calloused skin of my hands. Victor had installed a state-of-the-art biometric lock on the main entrance. A glowing red scanner waited expectantly for a verified thumbprint. He probably thought this expensive upgrade made his sanctuary impenetrable, but he was a man who only understood the surface level of corporate security. He did not understand the deep structural bones of the building. I bypassed the biometric scanner panel entirely. Instead, I reached into the deep pocket of my canvas janitor trousers and pulled out a small specialized magnetic bypass tool. I had personally mandated the installation of analog fail-safes during the final construction phase 20 years ago, specifically for emergency fire access. I pressed the metal tool against the discrete seam located just below the scanner. A soft mechanical click echoed in the silent, empty hallway. The heavy wooden doors unlatched and swung open with ease. I stepped inside and pulled them closed behind me, plunging myself into the dark domain my son-in-law had built. The pale moonlight spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long, sharp shadows across the room. Victor had completely redecorated the entire space. The warm oak furniture I used to prefer was gone, replaced by cold, black steel frosted glass and sterile white leather. It looked less like a place of business and more like a predatory trap. I walked over to his massive frosted glass desk. It was completely clear of any paperwork or scattered files. Victor was far too arrogant to leave physical evidence lying around in plain sight. But he was also a man driven heavily by ego. Arrogant men always need a secure place to hide their trophies. I knew he had a secondary stash, and I knew exactly where it would be. When I commissioned the architectural design for this skyscraper in 1995, I had the builders include a few structural secrets. One of them was a series of hidden wall safes integrated directly into the concrete columns of the executive floor. They were invisible to the naked eye, shielded behind custom mahogany paneling that lined the back wall of the office. Victor had ripped out my old comfortable furniture, but he had kept the expensive mahogany panels. I walked around the glass desk and approached the far wall. I ran my fingertips along the smooth wood grain, counting the vertical panels from left to right. 1, 2, 3, 4. I stopped at the 5th panel. To anyone else, it looked like a solid piece of decorative wood paneling, but I knew the hidden trick. I pressed my right palm flat against the center of the panel and applied exactly 20 pounds of upward pressure. The wood shifted upward with a faint metallic scrape. I slid the panel all the way up and locked it into the hidden ceiling groove. Behind it, set deep into the solid concrete pillar, was a heavy steel safe. Victor had updated the digital keypad on the safe door, but he had made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed the digital electronic lock was the only way inside. He did not know that the manufacturer had included a physical manual override keyhole hidden beneath the battery casing. It was a keyhole that matched a small, jagged brass key I had carried on my personal keychain for over 2 decades without fail. I pulled the brass key from my front pocket. My hands were perfectly steady. I inserted the key into the hidden slot and turned it firmly to the right. The heavy steel locking bolts retracted with a loud clank. I pulled the heavy door open. The dark inside of the safe was bathed in the faint glow of the city lights pouring in from outside. I reached in and pulled out a sleek silver laptop computer and a thick, heavy leather-bound ledger. I carried them over to the glass desk and set them both down carefully. I pulled a small pen flashlight from my pocket, gripping it between my teeth to keep my hands completely free. I opened the heavy leather ledger first. The pages were filled with meticulously recorded transactions, printed financial spreadsheets, and offshore bank account routing numbers. Victor was an extremely meticulous record keeper. He wanted to document his own criminal genius. I turned the pages, illuminating the tight columns with the narrow beam of my flashlight. The numbers were absolutely staggering. Millions of dollars were being systematically siphoned out of Apex Innovations through fake consulting fees, dummy vendors, and intentionally inflated material costs. But the true horror was hidden deep in the back half of the ledger. I found a section explicitly labeled with the name Obsidian Holdings. It was the mysterious shell company Jonathan had warned me about earlier that afternoon. The company that was rapidly positioning itself to execute a hostile buyout of Apex Innovations. I scanned the ownership documents attached to the Obsidian Holdings portfolio. My breath caught hard in my throat. The sole proprietor, the primary beneficiary, and the absolute sole managing director of Obsidian Holdings was Victor Lawson. The sheer scale of his massive betrayal hit me like a physical blow. He was not just a greedy executive skimming cash off the top. He was the devious architect of a massive calculated corporate slaughter. Victor was deliberately bankrupting my successful company from the inside out. He was creating artificial manufacturing crises, sabotaging critical supply chains, and purposefully missing quarterly revenue targets to drive the market stock price into the ground. I was firing thousands of loyal, hard-working men and women, stealing their severance packages and using that stolen money to directly fund his Obsidian Holdings. Then, once the stock price hit absolute rock bottom, he planned to use Obsidian Holdings to purchase the core assets of Apex Innovations for absolute pennies. He was using my own money to steal my own company, all while destroying the livelihoods of the people who had helped me build it. And to ensure absolutely no one could stop him, he was having my own daughter declare me legally insane so he could permanently steal my farm. He needed to seize the final proxy votes required to authorize the hostile takeover bid. I closed the heavy leather ledger tight. The silence of the dark office felt much heavier now, charged with the immense weight of the evidence sitting right in front of me. I had everything I needed. The financial records, the routing numbers, the direct, irrefutable connection between Victor Lawson and Obsidian Holdings. I pulled a small portable digital scanner from my janitor cart. I spent the next quiet hour meticulously scanning every single page of the ledger, saving the high-resolution images to a highly secure encrypted flash drive. I carefully unplugged the digital scanner and tucked the encrypted flash drive safely into the front pocket of my canvas shirt. My heart hammered with a steady, furious rhythm against my ribs. I turned my attention to the sleek silver laptop. I pressed the power button. A password prompt appeared immediately. Victor was incredibly predictable. He lacked any real imagination regarding his personal security. I typed in Rachel's birth date, followed by his own graduation year. The screen unlocked instantly, granting me full administrative access to his hidden files. I connected a specialized data extraction cable from my janitor cart into the side port of his machine. I initiated a complete system mirror, but the sheer volume of his encrypted files meant the process would take at least 12 agonizing minutes. In a silent, darkened building, 12 minutes feels like an eternity. Suddenly, the faint but unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. A flashlight beam swept across the frosted glass of the double doors. It was a night security patrol. I immediately reached down and dimmed the laptop screen to pure black. I dropped to my knees, sliding my body into the narrow, dark cavity beneath Victor's massive steel desk. I pulled my knees to my chest and held my breath. The brass doorknob rattled. The doors creaked open just a fraction of an inch. The beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight cut through the darkness of the office, sweeping over the leather chairs, bouncing off the hidden wall safe, and illuminating the floor just inches from my steel-toed boots. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I forced my body to remain as rigid as a statue. For 10 agonizing seconds, the guard lingered, his radio crackling with static. Finally, the heavy doors clicked shut. The footsteps slowly faded away down the carpeted corridor. I exhaled a slow, silent breath and crawled back into the leather chair, bringing the screen brightness back up. While the progress bar slowly crawled toward 100%, I couldn't resist opening Victor's private outbox. The emails I read made my blood run colder than the night air outside. I wasn't just destroying the company on a macro level. He was deeply, personally cruel. I found an email from a floor supervisor begging Victor for a brief extension on a deadline because 3 of his machinists were hospitalized with a severe flu. Victor's reply, sent to his HR director, simply read, "Fire the sick workers for insubordination and write up the supervisor. We aren't running a charity ward. If they can't bleed for the bottom line, replace them with cheaper temps by Monday." The absolute lack of basic human empathy was nauseating. He viewed the people who generated his wealth as disposable cogs, pieces of meat, to be ground up and discarded. I connected a specialized data extraction cable from my janitor cart into the side port of his machine. I initiated a complete system mirror copying his entire hard drive, his private emails, his hidden offshore routing logs, and his encrypted communication logs directly onto my secure device. The progress bar crept across the screen, slowly testing my patience in the silent room. I watched the numbers tick upward, each downloaded file representing another nail in his corporate coffin. When the transfer finally completed, I wiped the laptop screen clean with a microfiber cloth to remove any trace of my fingerprints. I placed the laptop and the leather ledger back into the hidden wall safe, arranging them exactly as I had originally found them. I gathered every piece of digital and physical evidence necessary. I would bury Victor Lawson under a mountain of federal indictments. Now I just needed to uncover his final dark secret. The drive away from the towering glass skyscraper felt different than the drive into the city. The heavy weight of uncertainty had vanished, replaced by the cold, sharp edge of absolute clarity. I had the ledger. I had the mirrored hard drive. I had the undeniable proof of Victor Lawson operating Obsidian Holdings. I steered my battered Silverado through the deserted streets, watching the streetlights reflect off the hood. The sky was just beginning to turn a bruised purple when I reached the outskirts of town. I did not go back to my farm. I could not risk Rachel showing up early to check on her fragile father. Instead, I drove to a 24-hour diner a few miles from the city center, nursing a cup of black coffee while I waited for the sun to rise. I needed to see Jonathan Reed the second he arrived at his office. At exactly 7 in the morning, I pulled into the private underground garage of the Horizon Trust building. Jonathan was already there, unlocking the heavy oak door to his secure suite. He looked surprised to see me standing in the corridor so early, still wearing the gray canvas janitor uniform. I walked past him into the office and set the encrypted flash drive and the secondary extraction cable onto his polished mahogany desk. I told him everything I had witnessed on the executive floor. I detailed the conversation by the elevator, the confirmation of the hostile buyout, and the damning evidence that Obsidian Holdings was completely controlled by Victor himself. Jonathan did not say a word. He sat down, plugged the drives into his isolated terminal, and began running his decryption protocols. The silence in the room grew heavy as the progress bars filled. "You were right, Richard," Jonathan said, his voice laced with a heavy disgust, as the financial ledgers finally populated his dual monitors. "Victor has engineered a perfect financial guillotine. He is using your company's own capital to fund the shell company that will eventually devour it. But he still needs the proxy votes from your estate to authorize the final sale. That is why Rachel is rushing to have you declared legally incompetent by Friday." I nodded, crossing my arms over my chest. "I understand his strategy for the hostile takeover, Jonathan. But I do not understand his obsession with my property. Last night, he specifically bragged to his mistress that Obsidian Holdings gets the lithium under the farm, and they walk away with $100 million. I need to know what that means. My farm is just 50 acres of dirt and old trees. It makes no sense." Jonathan frowned, tapping his fingers against the edge of his desk. "Lithium. That does not make any sense for a piece of standard agricultural zoning. Let me dig into the unencrypted files you pulled from his personal machine." His fingers flew across the keyboard. He bypassed the financial folders and dove straight into the localized project directories Victor had hidden under dummy titles. I watched the screens closely as a series of complex topographical maps and chemical analysis charts suddenly filled the displays. Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he read through a highly classified internal memo. "My," Jonathan breathed out, shaking his head in disbelief. "Richard, look at this." He turned one of the monitors toward me. It displayed a detailed geological survey map of the rural county where my farmhouse was located. A glowing red perimeter was drawn directly around my property lines. Underneath the map was a chemical density report, bearing the seal of a premier independent geological testing firm. "Victor did not just want your voting rights, Richard. He commissioned a covert deep soil analysis of your property and the surrounding acreage 8 months ago." I stared at the glowing red lines outlining the boundaries of the home where I had raised my daughter. "What did they find?" I asked, my voice steady despite the growing tension in my chest. Jonathan scrolled down to the executive summary of the report. "Your 50 acres sit directly on top of the largest untapped lithium vein in the entire state. The deposits are incredibly dense and positioned close to the surface. It is an absolute goldmine for battery manufacturing." I leaned back in my chair, the pieces of Victor's grand puzzle finally snapping together with terrifying clarity. It was a flawless trap. Apex Innovations had been struggling to secure a reliable lithium supply chain for our new renewable energy division. It was the one vulnerability threatening the future of the company. Victor knew this. He discovered the massive lithium deposit under my home. But instead of acquiring the land legitimately on behalf of the company, he decided to steal it for himself. "Exactly," Jonathan confirmed, pulling up a secondary financial projection document Victor had created. "Victor plans to use Rachel's power of attorney to seize your farm for absolutely nothing. Once you are locked away in the asylum, he will transfer the deed directly to Obsidian Holdings. Then, after his shell company completes the hostile takeover of Apex, he will force Apex to purchase the land from Obsidian for $100 million. He is essentially selling stolen land back to the company he is actively robbing." The sheer audacity of the scheme was breathtaking. Victor was not just a common thief. He was a corporate parasite, draining the lifeblood of an institution. I had spent 4 decades building all while plotting to legally kidnap me to secure his ultimate prize. And Rachel. My own daughter was fully complicit. She was willing to condemn her father to a locked memory care ward for the rest of his natural life, just so her husband could strip mine her childhood home for battery components. She traded my freedom for a massive payout she would not even get to enjoy. Victor had already made it explicitly clear he planned to divorce her the moment the funds were secured. The ultimate irony was suffocating. She was helping him build the very trap that would eventually crush her. I looked at the geological map one more time, the land where I buried my beloved Patricia. the soil where I planted oak trees, hoping to watch my future grandchildren play under their shade. Victor saw nothing but dollar signs. He looked at my entire life and saw only raw materials waiting to be harvested. I closed my eyes, letting the final shreds of paternal hesitation dissolve into the cold air of the underground office. There would be no mercy for Victor Lawson. The man thought he had outsmarted a senile farmer. I thought his deception was impenetrable. I stood up slowly from the leather chair, bracing my hands flat against the mahogany desk, and looked Jonathan straight in his unblinking eyes. I need you to prepare the complete legal framework for an absolute devastating counterstrike. We are going to completely obliterate his corporate existence starting right now. Today. He wanted to steal my legacy and my freedom. I will take everything that he has ever valued. I left the underground office with the rising sun casting long shadows across the city streets. My mind was no longer a storm of betrayal and grief. It was a perfectly organized battlefield. I had instructed Jonathan to painstakingly prepare the legal and financial weapons we would inevitably need to dismantle Victor completely from the inside out. But as I drove my worn-out Chevy Silverado down the rural highway back to my farm, a sudden sharp sense of urgency gripped my chest. Victor was moving much faster than I had anticipated. He was arrogant, but he was also extremely impatient. He had the fake dementia diagnosis. He had Rachel totally under his control. I pressed my foot harder against the gas pedal, the engine of the old truck roaring, as I sped down the familiar country roads. As I rounded the final bend approaching my property, a loud grinding mechanical noise shattered the quiet morning air. I slammed on the brakes, throwing up a massive cloud of loose gravel. My stomach dropped completely. Two massive yellow excavators were parked right at the edge of my property line. Their heavy steel treads were brutally chewing up the soft earth I had carefully tended for a decade. A crew of contractors in high-visibility vests were actively tearing down the wrought iron front gate I had welded with my own two hands. I parked the truck aggressively, leaving the engine running. I stepped out, my heavy work boots hitting the dirt. And then I saw him. Victor Lawson was standing on the wraparound wooden porch of my farmhouse. He was wearing a flawlessly tailored navy blue suit that looked completely absurd against the rustic weathered backdrop of my beloved family home. He held a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a rolled-up set of architectural blueprints in the other. I was pointing casually toward the old oak trees, directing a foreman on exactly where to position the heavy machinery. He looked exactly like a conqueror surveying a freshly captured territory. My blood boiled intensely. He had not even waited for the Friday commitment to the asylum. He was already treating my private family home as his own personal commercial construction site, without any legal authorization whatsoever. I walked up the long driveway, my strides long and purposeful. The contractors paused their work immediately, sensing the sudden tension radiating from me. Victor turned around and spotted me approaching. His arrogant smirk widened into a bright, completely artificial smile. He walked down the wooden porch steps to meet me, spreading his arms wide as if welcoming me to my own house. "Richard," he called out, his voice practically dripping with fake enthusiasm. "You are back early today. I hope you had a nice, relaxing morning drive. The fresh air is supposed to be incredibly good for your failing memory and deteriorating cognitive health." "What is the exact meaning of this, Victor?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. I pointed a finger toward the massive excavators currently crushing my front gate. Victor chuckled softly, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Oh, do not worry yourself about the noise, Richard. We are just doing some light landscaping for you. Rachel and I were talking last night. With your rapidly deteriorating condition, we realized this old property is just not safe for you anymore. We are widening the access roads for emergency medical vehicles and clearing out some of those dangerous dead trees. We are just trying to make the entire place much safer for your current medical condition. It is all for your own good." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his obvious lie was absolutely staggering, to witness in person. He was actively tearing down my physical defenses to prepare the ground for his heavy mining equipment, and yet he actually dared to package his disgusting greed as a genuine act of profound familial love. I did not waste my breath arguing with him. I simply turned around in silence and walked straight back to the open door of my Silverado. I reached behind the driver's seat and pulled out my heavy 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. I always kept it fully loaded with blank rounds to scare off the aggressive coyotes that occasionally wandered too close to the property line. I racked the slide with deliberate force. The loud, distinctive metallic clack echoed sharply over the low rumble of the idling excavators. The contractors immediately froze in place. I raised the long, dark barrel toward the open blue sky and pulled the trigger without a second thought. The blank round fired with a deafening boom. The explosive sound ripped through the crisp morning air, startling a large flock of black crows out of the nearby oak trees. The foreman yelled a panicked order, and the heavy machinery immediately powered down into total silence. I lowered the smoking barrel and leveled my cold gaze directly at the group of terrified workers. "Get off my land right now!" I roared, my voice booming with a commanding authority I had not utilized in over 5 years. "You have exactly 2 minutes to pack up your equipment and leave this property entirely, or the county sheriff will be arriving to arrest every single one of you for criminal trespassing." The contractors did not need to be told twice. They scrambled frantically toward their heavy utility trucks, abandoning the torn metal gate and the scattered blueprints. Victor, however, did not run. He stood his ground on my lawn, though the arrogant, mocking smile had completely vanished from his face. His cold eyes were dark, suddenly filled with a venomous, highly calculating hatred that he no longer bothered to hide behind a polite mask of empty social pleasantries. As his hired crew sped away down the dusty dirt road, Victor walked slowly toward me. He stepped uncomfortably close, intentionally invading my personal space to try and establish physical dominance. The sharp scent of his expensive designer cologne mixed violently with the acrid smell of the spent gunpowder lingering in the air. He looked down at me, his jaw clenched tight with silent fury. "Enjoy the tough guy act while it lasts." "Old man," Victor sneered, his voice dropping into a vicious, quiet whisper meant only for me to hear. "You think a loud noise is going to stop what is coming? By Friday morning, you will be drooling helplessly in a wheelchair inside a locked, padded room, and every single inch of this incredibly valuable dirt will finally be mine to do with as I please." He stood there for another moment, letting his cruel threat hang between us. He expected me to shatter. He wanted to see fear flood into my eyes. He wanted me to beg for mercy, to plead for my freedom. But I did not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply stared back at him with an expression of absolute, unshakable calm. I lowered the barrel of my shotgun and offered him a tight, knowing smile. Victor turned on his heel and marched down the driveway. He slowly drove his car away. The trap was set. The trap was set. As Victor's car disappeared in a cloud of dust down the rural highway, I walked calmly back into my farmhouse. I did not feel an ounce of fear regarding his threats. I walked straight to the kitchen telephone and dialed Jonathan Reed's direct secure line. He answered on the first ring. I told him about the encounter on the lawn, about the excavators, and about the deadline. Victor had promised I would be locked inside a padded room by Friday. That gave us exactly 48 hours to execute the final phase of our financial warfare. I gave Jonathan the absolute authorization to unleash the full, limitless capital of the Horizon Trust. I ordered him to execute a hostile, completely anonymous acquisition of Obsidian Holdings. Because Obsidian was a private shell company, Victor had hidden its ownership structure behind layers of proxy directors. But with billions of dollars at our disposal, Jonathan simply bought out the proxy directors through a European subsidiary, effectively absorbing Obsidian Holdings into our own portfolio without Victor ever receiving a single notification. The irony was incredibly sweet. By Thursday afternoon, Victor Lawson was frantically funneling millions of dollars of embezzled Apex Innovations funds directly into a shell company that I now legally owned. He was robbing my company to pay me. And he was entirely oblivious to his own impending doom. With the financial snare pulled tight, I prepared for the physical confrontation. I knew Victor and Rachel would not leave the asylum commitment to chance. They would send professionals to collect me. Friday morning arrived with a thick, heavy fog rolling over the quiet fields of my farm. Today was the day of the grand 10th anniversary gala for Apex Innovations. It was also the day my daughter planned to legally erase my existence. I woke up before dawn, brewed a pot of strong black coffee, and unlocked the front gate. I wanted to make it very easy for them to drive right up to the house. But I was not going to face them alone. At 6 in the morning, 3 unmarked black sport utility vehicles pulled quietly into the back of my property hidden from the main road. Jonathan Reed stepped out of the lead vehicle, accompanied by 3 highly trained, heavily armed private security contractors employed directly by the Horizon Trust. They were large, intimidating men dressed in sharp black suits, moving with quiet, disciplined precision. We sat around my rustic wooden dining table drinking coffee in the dim morning light, waiting for Rachel's hired thugs to arrive. At exactly 8 o'clock, a stark white medical transport van, without any distinguishing hospital logos, crunched slowly up the gravel driveway. The vehicle parked aggressively close to the front porch. 2 burly orderlies stepped out. They were massive men, built like linebackers, wearing tight white medical scrubs. One of them carried a heavy canvas straitjacket draped casually over his thick forearm. The other held a clipboard containing the fraudulent medical orders my daughter had purchased from the corrupt neurologist. They walked up the wooden steps with heavy, arrogant boots. They did not bother to knock. They assumed they were dealing with a frail, confused dementia patient who lived completely alone. The lead orderly simply kicked the front door open, the locking mechanism shattering inward with a loud splintering crack. "All right, old man," the first orderly barked, stepping heavily into the living room. "Time to go for a little ride. Your daughter sent us to take you to a nice, safe place. Let us not make this difficult." He stopped dead in his tracks. The arrogant smirk vanished from his thick face. The second orderly bumped into him from behind, peering over his shoulder before freezing entirely. I was not sitting helplessly in a rocking chair. I was sitting at the head of my dining table, casually stirring a fresh cup of coffee. Standing behind me, forming an impenetrable wall of dark suits, were the 3 private security contractors from the Horizon Trust. Their hands rested calmly near the holstered weapons at their waists. Their eyes were locked onto the 2 intruders with cold, calculated menace. Jonathan Reed sat to my right, calmly reviewing a stack of legal documents. He did not even bother to look up at the men who had just kicked down my door. The silence in the farmhouse was absolute and terrifying. The lead orderly swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously between the armed contractors and my calm, unwavering gaze. The heavy canvas straitjacket slipped slightly from his grip. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee and set the ceramic mug down on the wooden table. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. "You have entered private property under completely false pretenses. The medical authorization you are holding is a fraudulent document procured through criminal bribery. The men standing behind me are authorized to defend my physical safety with whatever force they deem entirely necessary. I suggest you turn around and walk away right now." For a brief, tense moment, the lead orderly bristled. His ego was heavily bruised by being spoken down to by an old man in a flannel shirt. He puffed out his massive chest and took a heavy, aggressive step forward. "Listen here, Grandpa," he sneered, trying to call what he thought was a bluff. "I don't care who these guys in suits are. We have a legally binding medical order signed by a licensed doctor. You are coming with us even if we have to drag you out of here by your ankles." Before I could say another word, Jonathan Reed calmly stood up from the table. He picked up a crisp manila folder and opened it. "Marcus Vance," Jonathan said, his voice slicing through the room with surgical precision. The orderly froze, stunned to hear his actual name. Jonathan adjusted his glasses and continued reading. 2 prior convictions for aggravated assault. Currently employed by a Shell medical transport company operating out of a strip mall in Chicago. You are being paid $10,000 under the table to execute a fraudulent medical transport. If you take one more step toward Mr. Caldwell, you will not be facing a simple trespassing charge. I will personally ensure you are indicted by the federal government for conspiracy to commit kidnapping across county lines, elder abuse, and medical fraud. You will spend the next 25 years inside a maximum security penitentiary. To punctuate Jonathan's legal execution, the lead security contractor standing behind me subtly shifted his stance. He didn't draw his weapon, but his large hand rested definitively on the grip of his holstered firearm. The audible crisp click of a safety mechanism being disengaged echoed sharply in the silent living room. It was a universal language that Marcus Vance understood perfectly. The color rapidly drained from the orderly's flushed face. His aggressive posturing evaporated in an instant, replaced by the sheer primal panic of a predator that suddenly realizes it has wandered into the cage of a much larger beast. The orderlies did not hesitate. The prospect of an easy paycheck for bullying an old farmer had completely evaporated, replaced by the very real threat of physical violence and federal prison. They backed out of the doorway, slowly keeping their hands visible before turning and sprinting down the porch steps. They jumped into their unmarked white van, the tires spinning wildly in the dirt as they sped frantically back down the rural highway. I watched them disappear into the morning fog. I picked up my mobile phone from the table and dialed my daughter's number. She answered on the second ring. The background noise sounded busy, filled with the clinking of glasses and the chatter of event planners. She was likely at the hotel overseeing the final preparations for the massive corporate gala. "Hello," Rachel answered, her tone tight with anticipation. "Hi, sweetie," I said, pitching my voice to sound incredibly frail, confused, and weak. I let out a trembling sigh. "The nice men in white coats just picked me up. They said you sent them. They said I am going to a special place where I can rest." A sharp, audible sigh of profound relief escaped Rachel's lips. The sound cut right through my chest, severing the very last thread of paternal affection I held for her. She had actually done it. She believed she had successfully locked her father away forever, and she was relieved. "Yes, Dad," Rachel said, adopting a soothing, deeply patronizing tone. "You are going to a wonderful facility called Sunset Pines. They have specialized doctors there who are going to take very good care of your memory. Victor and I will come visit you as soon as we can, I promise. You just relax and let the orderlies handle everything." "Thank you," I whispered, clutching the phone. "Have fun tonight." "We certainly will, Dad. Goodbye now." The line went dead. I lowered the phone and placed it flat on the table. The frail, trembling persona washed away instantly. The time for hiding was over. I looked at Jonathan Reed. He closed his briefcase. "Let us go," I said. I walked out the broken front door of my farmhouse. The morning fog was finally beginning to lift, revealing the vast green fields of the property my daughter had just tried to steal. Jonathan Reed nodded silently. Jonathan turned to me before opening his car door. He told me he would finalize the acquisition paperwork for Obsidian Holdings and meet me at the venue tonight. I watched his vehicle kick up dust as it headed back toward the city. The trap was now fully operational. Victor Lawson was currently sitting in his glass office, unaware that his shell company was now legally owned by me. I went back inside the quiet house to prepare for the evening. The 10th anniversary gala for Apex Innovations was scheduled to begin at 7 o'clock. It was supposed to be a night of corporate triumph for Victor. A glittering event where he would announce massive layoffs to manufacture a crisis, setting the stage for his hostile buyout. I had spent the last 5 years hiding from that world content, to live a simple life in the shadows, while my family enjoyed the fruits of my labor. But tonight, the shadow was coming to the party. I could walk into that luxury hotel ballroom, wearing a $10,000 tuxedo, and command the room with wealth alone. But I closed the closet door. I did not want to look like them. I did not want to blend in with the parasitic elite who thought moving numbers on a spreadsheet was actual work. I walked over to a heavy cedar chest sitting at the foot of my bed. I unlatched the brass locks and lifted the heavy wooden lid. Inside, folded carefully, were the clothes I had worn 40 years ago when I laid the very first brick for the original Apex manufacturing warehouse. I pulled out a faded red and black plaid flannel shirt. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows, soft from years of hard labor and sweat. Next, I took out a pair of heavy dark blue denim work jeans, their knees permanently stained with ghost traces of industrial grease and concrete dust. Finally, I reached to the bottom of the chest and retrieved a pair of scuffed, heavy brown steel-toed work boots. The leather was deeply creased, marked by decades of navigating dangerous factory floors and overseeing massive construction sites. I took off my casual morning clothes and dressed myself in the garments of my past. I buttoned the flannel shirt and laced up the heavy steel-toed boots. I stood in front of the full-length mirror on the wall. I did not look like a corporate executive. I did not look like an old, frail dementia patient waiting to be locked inside a memory care ward. I looked exactly like a man who knew how to build an empire with his bare hands, and more importantly, a man who knew exactly how to tear one down. They were about to learn that true power does not need a tailored suit. True power is the absolute control over the ground you stand on. Putting on these old work clothes felt like putting on a suit of armor forged in fire and absolute resolve. I walked back into the living room and approached my sturdy oak desk. Resting on the surface was a heavy brown leather briefcase. I opened the brass clasps and began to assemble my arsenal. This was not going to be a physical fight. It was going to be an execution by documentation. I placed the items inside with deliberate care. First, I packed the original yellowed incorporation papers for Apex Innovations, legally establishing the Horizon Trust as the sole 100% majority shareholder and naming Richard Caldwell as the ultimate beneficiary. This single document completely invalidated any authority Victor believed he possessed. Second, I slid in the thick printed offshore financial audit Jonathan had finalized that morning. It contained every encrypted ledger dummy vendor invoice and illegal wire transfer Victor had made. It proved beyond a doubt that Victor was the sole proprietor of Obsidian Holdings and had embezzled $50 million from my company. Third, I carefully placed a small black digital audio recorder into a side pocket of the briefcase. It contained the crystal-clear recording of Rachel standing on my front porch, coldly paying the corrupt fake neurologist to fraudulently declare me insane so she could commit me to a locked asylum. Finally, I placed the original property deed to my 50-acre farm inside the leather folder. The very land sitting on top of the massive lithium deposit they were so desperate to steal. I snapped the brass clasps of the briefcase shut. The metallic sound was sharp and definitive in the empty house. The briefcase was heavy weighted down with the total destruction of my daughter and my son-in-law. I felt no hesitation. Rachel had made her choice when she sighed with relief upon hearing I had been taken by the orderlies. She had severed the bond of family, leaving only the cold reality of business. I grabbed my truck keys from the kitchen counter, walked out the front door, and locked it securely behind me. The late afternoon sun was beginning to cast a golden glow across the fields as I walked down the wooden porch steps. I climbed into the cab of my beat-up 2012 Chevy Silverado. I tossed the heavy leather briefcase onto the passenger seat. I turned the ignition key, and the old V8 engine roared to life with a comforting, familiar rumble. I shifted the truck into drive and pulled out of the dirt driveway, kicking up a trail of dust behind me. I watched the sprawling green pastures and rustic wooden fences give way to concrete overpasses, heavy traffic, and towering glass skyscrapers, reflecting the fading sunlight. The sky transitioned from a bright, hopeful orange into a deep, bruised purple as the city lights began to flicker on one by one. I drove through the bustling downtown streets, ignoring the strange looks from drivers in expensive luxury sedans, as my muddy, dented truck idled beside them at red lights. I was a ghost returning to haunt my machine. As I approached the perimeter of the downtown financial district, the grand facade of the Four Seasons Hotel came into view. The streets surrounding the luxury venue were completely choked with black town cars, stretch limousines, and news vans. Searchlights swept across the night sky, illuminating the massive banners celebrating the 10th anniversary of Apex Innovations. A red carpet had been rolled out over the pristine pavement, lined with velvet ropes and aggressive security personnel holding back a crowd of reporters and curious onlookers. Victor spared no expense throwing himself a coronation. I gripped the Silverado steering wheel. The calm before the storm settled over me like a heavy winter blanket. I was not nervous. I was not angry. I was simply the inevitable consequence of their incredible greed. I steered my muddy, roaring truck directly toward the glowing entrance of the red carpet. The bright spotlights of the Four Seasons Hotel cut through the night sky like glowing blades. The sheer extravagance of the 10th anniversary gala for Apex Innovations was on full display. A pristine red carpet stretched from the grand glass doors all the way to the street. Sleek black town cars and polished limousines formed a slow-moving line. Men in sharply tailored tuxedos and women in shimmering evening gowns stepped gracefully onto the carpet. They paused to pose for the flashing bulbs of the corporate press. It was a perfectly choreographed parade of wealth and power. I did not wait in the polite line of luxury vehicles. I pressed my heavy steel-toed boot down hard on the accelerator. The old 8-cylinder engine of my Chevy Silverado let out a raw, deafening roar. The mechanical growl violently shattered the refined atmosphere of the hotel driveway. I steered my battered truck completely out of the designated queue. I drove straight up the center lane, clumps of dried country dirt falling from my wheel wells onto the immaculate pavement. I slammed on my brakes, bringing the truck to a harsh, squealing stop directly at the velvet ropes. A young valet in a crisp maroon uniform rushed forward immediately. His eyes were wide with absolute panic as he waved his hands frantically in the air. I ignored his gestures entirely. I shifted the heavy transmission into park, pulled the keys from the ignition, and stepped out into the cool night air. The heavy thud of my boots on the pavement sounded like a gavel striking wood. The valet ran up to my door, his voice trembling with fear. "Sir, you absolutely cannot park here," he stammered loudly. "I will have to call a tow truck right now." I looked down at the young man. I felt a brief flash of sympathy. He was just a kid doing his job, completely unaware that he was threatening to tow the vehicle belonging to the man who owned the corporate entity he was hired to protect. I reached into the front pocket of my faded jeans. I pulled out a crisp $100 bill. I pressed the cash firmly into his open palm. "You can tow it if you want to, son," I said, keeping my voice calm. "But I suggest you leave it right where it is. I am not going to be inside very long." I grabbed my briefcase and turned my back on him. I walked straight past the velvet ropes. My heavy boots hit the pavement with a slow, deliberate, and rhythmic thud. The contrast between me and the other invited guests was incredibly jarring. They were draped in fine silk and expensive diamonds, projecting a carefully curated image of untouchable wealth. I was wearing a faded flannel shirt, stained blue denim jeans, and boots that had kicked through wet concrete for 4 decades. But I did not feel small. I felt like the solid foundation upon which all their fragile, glittering illusions were actively built. I approached the glass doors of the Grand Hotel lobby. 2 imposing security guards in dark suits immediately moved to intercept me. They raised their hands to physically block my path. "Sir, this is a secured private event." The taller guard stated, his tone flat. "You need to leave the premises right now before we remove you by force." I did not break my stride. I looked him directly in the eyes with the absolute certainty of a man who held the power of total corporate ruin. "I am Richard Caldwell," I said, "and I am exactly where I need to be." The sheer confidence in my voice caused the guard to hesitate for a fraction of a second. That tiny window of uncertainty was all the opening I needed. I pushed past their extended arms and stepped directly into the grand lobby. The scale of the opulence was staggering. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm light over the polished marble floors. Waiters in white gloves circulated smoothly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with flutes of expensive champagne and delicate spoonfuls of imported caviar. A string quartet played classical music softly in the corner. But as I walked deeper into the crowded room, the classical music seemed to fade into the background. A distinct ripple of confusion, shock, and open disgust began to spread rapidly through the wealthy attendees. People stopped talking mid-sentence. Lively conversations died out completely as heads turned to stare at the dirty farmer walking purposefully through their pristine gathering. The dense sea of expensive suits and beautiful gowns physically parted in front of me, creating a wide path directly toward the main ballroom doors. They backed away from me quickly, acting as if hard physical labor were highly contagious. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead. I stepped through the grand archway and entered the main ballroom. At the far end of the room, standing proudly in front of a massive wall of white roses, bearing the glowing Apex corporate logo, were Victor and Rachel. They were posing elegantly for corporate photographers, their faces plastered with radiant artificial smiles. Rachel was wearing a stunning emerald green designer gown. Victor wore a custom-tailored black tuxedo that fit him with a sleek, predatory perfection. They looked exactly like corporate royalty, completely drunk on their impending wealth. They were celebrating a victory they believed they had completely secured that very morning. They genuinely thought I was currently sitting in a locked, padded room, strapped into a heavy canvas straitjacket. They thought they had completely erased my existence from their glamorous, high-stakes world. I walked steadily down the wide center aisle of the ballroom. The heavy rhythmic thud of my work boots echoed sharply against the polished marble floor. I stopped exactly 20 feet away from the brilliant photography wall. I stood perfectly still, holding my heavy leather briefcase firmly by my side. The flashing bulbs of the press cameras illuminated the space like captured lightning. And then Rachel turned her head slightly to the left. Her eyes swept across the crowded room and locked directly onto mine. The radiant smile instantly vanished from her face. All the color drained rapidly from her cheeks, leaving her looking exactly like a terrified ghost. She took a sudden, staggering step backward in sheer shock, her high heel catching awkwardly on the hem of her expensive gown. Her trembling hand flew up to cover her mouth to stifle an audible gasp of pure horror. Victor noticed her sudden panic. He turned his head sharply, following the exact direction of her terrified gaze. When he saw me standing there in my faded flannel shirt and dirty boots, his handsome features twisted violently into a dark mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He realized instantly that his hired orderlies had failed. He lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. His voice boomed loudly over the quiet crowd, echoing through the ballroom. Security Victor screamed aloud, his face red with rage. "Get him out! Grab him now! He is a dementia patient who escaped his ward. Remove him." 2 hotel security guards broke away from their posts near the main entrance. They rushed toward me with alarming speed. They grabbed my arms roughly, their heavy hands digging into the worn fabric of my flannel shirt. A gasp rippled through the ballroom as the wealthy attendees stepped back to avoid the altercation. Rachel stood by the flower wall, her eyes wide with terror and relief, believing her problem was finally dragged away. I did not struggle against the tight grip of the guards. I did not raise my voice or attempt to pull away. I stood my ground. I looked past the blinding flashes of the cameras, directing my gaze toward the VIP balcony overlooking the grand ballroom. Standing there was Jonathan Reed. He looked down at the scene below with absolute calm. He caught my eye and offered a faint smile. Jonathan turned his head toward a tall man near the edge of the balcony. It was the director of global security for Apex Innovations. Jonathan gave him a single, deliberate nod. The security director raised his wrist to his mouth, and spoke a command into his radio. The two hotel guards holding my arms stiffened. The earpieces they wore buzzed with a transmission. Their aggressive expressions vanished, replaced by sheer confusion. Without a word to the bewildered crowd, both guards released my arms. They stepped backward, lowering their heads respectfully, and clasped their hands behind their backs. They formed a protective barrier beside me, ignoring Victor and his frantic orders. Victor stopped screaming. He stared at the security guards in total disbelief. He looked around the silent ballroom, realizing that the people he paid to protect him were now refusing his direct commands. A deep panic set into his features. He realized he was rapidly losing control of the narrative in front of the most important shareholders in the country. He had to act immediately to secure his prize before the situation spiraled out of his grasp. Abandoning Rachel by the photography wall, Victor spun around and sprinted up the short flight of stairs leading to the main stage. He rushed toward the acrylic podium in the center of the platform. He grabbed the microphone with trembling hands, adjusting his bow tie as he forced an artificial smile onto his sweating face. He tapped the microphone twice, commanding the attention of the murmuring crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor announced, his voice projecting manufactured authority. "I sincerely apologize for that minor disturbance. We will have the unauthorized individuals safely escorted off the premises very shortly. But please, I ask for your full attention. We have gathered here tonight to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Apex Innovations. However, as your chief executive, it is my duty to address the severe financial realities threatening the survival of our beloved company." The ballroom grew dead silent. The attendees exchanged worried, nervous glances. Victor gripped the edges of the podium, leaning into the microphone to deliver his fatal blow. "To save Apex Innovations from total collapse, I must announce a painful but necessary restructuring. Effective immediately, we will be laying off 2,000 workers from our manufacturing division. To stabilize our falling stock, we agreed to an emergency sale of our core industrial assets to a private firm known as Obsidian Holdings. It is a necessary sacrifice for our future." A wave of shocked murmurs erupted across the grand ballroom. The reporters in the back of the room immediately began typing on their devices, capturing the corporate news. The shareholders whispered in panic, unaware that the man on the stage was selling their company to himself using their own stolen money. Victor stood tall behind the podium, breathing heavily, believing he had just executed the final phase of his master plan. The words were out. The panic was real. The hostile buyout was officially in motion. He looked proud of his own ruthless genius. I tightened my grip on the heavy handle of my brown leather briefcase. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool breeze fill my lungs. I stepped forward. I began to walk straight up the center aisle of the ballroom, moving directly toward the stage. The heavy thud of my boots against the marble floor cut right through the chatter of the crowd. The wealthy elite turned to look at me, their faces painted with fascination. As I moved forward, the dense sea of expensive suits and evening gowns naturally parted, creating a clear path for me to walk. I did not rush. I walked with the slow pace of a man who owned the very ground beneath his feet. Victor saw me approaching from the stage. The arrogant pride vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a frantic terror. He leaned over the microphone, his voice cracking loudly over the speakers. "Security," Victor yelled, his tone desperate and unhinged. I gave a direct order. I said, "Remove him right now. Grab him." Not a single security guard in the entire building moved an inch. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the chief executive of a multi-billion-dollar corporation had a public meltdown over an old man in a flannel shirt. As I reached the stage stairs, a side door near the curtains opened smoothly. Jonathan Reed stepped out from the shadows, impeccably dressed in a dark suit. He walked onto the stage with a calm presence that dwarfed Victor and his screaming. Jonathan approached the podium. He did not say a word to Victor. He reached out and firmly wrapped his hand around the stem of the microphone. Victor tried to pull it away, his eyes wide, but Jonathan delivered a cold glare that made Victor freeze entirely. Jonathan pulled the microphone from Victor's fingers and stepped to the front of the stage, looking out over the confused faces. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan said, his deep voice echoing through the silent ballroom with absolute authority, "please forgive the interruption to our scheduled programming. As the managing director of the Horizon Trust, it is my distinct honor to clarify the current leadership structure of this organization." Victor stumbled backward, his knees buckling beneath the weight of his own realization. He looked at Jonathan, then down at me, standing at the base of the stairs, the horrifying truth dawning on his mind. Jonathan gestured respectfully toward me with an open hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan continued, "let me introduce the sole beneficiary of the Horizon Trust, the founder and the majority shareholder of Apex Innovations, Mr. Richard Caldwell." The reaction was devastating. The massive ballroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Near the photography wall, the champagne glass slipped through Rachel's trembling fingers. It hit the ground and shattered into jagged pieces, the sound ringing out like a gunshot in the quiet room. Victor stumbled backward, his hands gripping the edges of the acrylic podium just to keep himself from collapsing to the floor. All the blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale white. He stared down at me, his eyes wide with suffocating horror as the destruction of his corporate life rushed up to meet him. I climbed the short, carpeted steps leading up to the main stage. The heavy thud of my work boots felt like a steady heartbeat echoing through the grand ballroom. I walked past the massive floral arrangements and stopped right next to the clear acrylic podium. Victor was completely frozen. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a crumbling cliff. His tailored tuxedo suddenly seemed far too large for his shrinking frame. Jonathan Reed stood beside me, radiating quiet authority. He handed me the microphone. I grasped the smooth metal handle. It felt cool and heavy in my calloused palm. I looked out over the sea of wealthy shareholders, corporate journalists, and terrified executives. They were staring at me in absolute silence. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. I turned my head and looked directly at Victor Lawson. He was sweating profusely. A single drop of perspiration rolled down the side of his pale face. I brought the microphone up to my mouth. "Good evening," I said. My voice was calm and steady. It carried across the enormous room without a single tremor. "My name is Richard Caldwell. 40 years ago, I poured the first concrete foundation for Apex Innovations with my own 2 bare hands. I built this company on the principles of hard work, honesty, and absolute loyalty to the people who dedicate their lives to the assembly line. 5 years ago, I stepped away from the public eye. I wanted to live a quiet life on my farm. I placed my entire ownership stake into a blind trust and allowed my son-in-law to take the reins as chief executive. I trusted him to lead this company with honor. I was entirely wrong." A quiet murmur swept through the crowd, but it died down the second I raised my free hand. I turned back to face Victor. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his crisp white shirt. "You stood on this stage tonight and told these good people that our company was failing," I continued. "You claimed that we needed to lay off 2,000 loyal manufacturing workers to survive a financial crisis. You announced a necessary corporate sacrifice and the impending sale of our core assets to a private firm known as Obsidian Holdings. You painted a very convincing picture of a dying company," I said, taking a step closer to him. But there is absolutely no financial crisis at Apex Innovations. The only crisis here is the cancer of your own unprecedented greed. You have spent the last 8 months intentionally sabotaging our supply chains. You delayed our product launches and actively tanked our market stock price. You did all of this to artificially lower the valuation of the company so that your mysterious shell company could swoop in and execute a hostile buyout for absolute pennies. The ballroom erupted into shocked gasps. Wealthy investors began whispering frantically to one another. I held up my hand again, and the room silenced immediately. "You thought you were a brilliant corporate raider, Victor," I said, my tone turning dangerously cold. You thought you could bankrupt my life's work, steal the massive lithium deposit sitting underneath my family farm, and walk away with $100 million in your pocket. You thought you could throw me into a locked asylum to silence the only man who could stop you. But you made one fatal miscalculation. I opened my heavy brown leather briefcase. I pulled out the thick stack of financial audits Jonathan had prepared. You assumed the old farmer was too stupid to understand your game. But did you bother to check the International Corporate Registry this morning, Victor? I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment. The Horizon Trust completely acquired Obsidian Holdings yesterday afternoon. Victor staggered backward as if he had been physically struck by a heavy blow. His shoulders slumped, and he gripped the edge of the acrylic podium to stop himself from collapsing. You do not own the shell company anymore, I told him. I own it. And because I own it, I also own full access to its internal banking ledgers. I held up the thick stack of paper for the entire ballroom to see clearly. I have the complete offshore audit right here in my hand. You were so desperate to fund your hostile takeover that you took out $50 million in illegal high-interest personal loans. You embezzled corporate funds and funneled that stolen money directly into Obsidian Holdings. You literally robbed my company to pay me. You funneled your own stolen wealth into a trap that I now completely control. Victor let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp. His legs finally gave out beneath him. He dropped heavily onto his knees, right there on the polished stage. His expensive tuxedo pants pooled around his legs. And since I am now the sole legal owner of your massive personal debt, I am officially calling it in, I announced, my voice ringing with absolute finality. Effective immediately. You do not just lose your job tonight, Victor. You are $50 million in debt, and you are completely bankrupt. Furthermore, this audit has already been transmitted to the federal authorities. You are looking at decades in federal prison for massive corporate embezzlement and fraud. The destruction of Victor Lawson was absolute. He knelt on the floor, a completely broken man, staring blankly at my steel-toed boots. I looked down at him without a single ounce of pity. You built a house of cards on a foundation of lies, Victor. You thought that wearing a tailored suit and manipulating spreadsheets made you a powerful man. But real power does not come from deceit. Real power comes from the ground you stand on and the people you uplift. Yao betrayed the workers who trusted you to protect their livelihoods. You treated thousands of dedicated families like disposable liabilities. You treated my own daughter like a stepping stone for your selfish ambition. Now you get to face the devastating reality of your actions. There will be no golden parachute for you tonight. There will be no luxurious escape to the sunny beaches of the Bahamas with your mistress. The security director of Apex Innovations has already locked down the entire executive floor. Every single asset you thought you secured offshore has been frozen by federal investigators. Your bank accounts are empty. Your career is completely obliterated. You have absolutely nothing left. The corporate press captured every single moment of his humiliating downfall. The bright flashes of their heavy cameras illuminated his weeping face. The elite shareholders who applauded his arrival now looked at him with absolute disgust. He was a spectacular failure. I turned away from his trembling figure and looked at the silent crowd. The truth was fully exposed, leaving no shadows for him to hide behind. His reign of terror was completely and finally over for good. I had protected the legacy of my late wife and secured the livelihoods of my loyal workers. The future was now safe. I took a deep, calming breath of the fresh air. The silence in the ballroom was broken by frantic clicking of heels. Rachel pushed through the onlookers. She sprinted to the stage, her green gown dragging. Her makeup was ruined by mascara. She reached the stairs and tripped, scrambling up the steps until she stood before me. She ignored Victor, who was kneeling in shock. She grabbed my faded flannel shirt. Dad, Rachel cried hysterically, her voice echoing through the microphone. You have to listen to me. I did not know anything about this. I swear I did not know what he was planning. Victor manipulated me. He lied to me about the company. He lied about the hostile buyout. You know I would never do something like this to you. I love you, Dad. Please believe me. She looked at me with pleading eyes. It was the same look she used when she was a little girl, hoping my love would shield her from consequences. But she was no longer a little girl, and what she had broken could never be repaired. I stood there looking down at the woman she had chosen to become. Do not do this, Rachel, I said, my voice radiating only cold exhaustion. Do not insult my intelligence by playing the victim. No, Dad, please, she sobbed, gripping my shirt tighter. I was just trying to protect you. Victor told me your mind was failing. He told me the farm was not safe for you anymore. I just wanted to make sure you were taken care of properly. I did not know he was trying to steal your land. I gently pried her trembling fingers off my shirt. I stepped back. I reached into the pocket of my worn denim jeans and pulled out the small digital audio recorder I had packed into my briefcase earlier. I held it up so she could see it. The blood drained from Rachel's face. She recognized the device immediately. You did not know about the lithium, I repeated quietly. Perhaps that part is true. Perhaps Victor kept you in the dark about his ultimate financial endgame. But you knew exactly what you were doing to me. You knew exactly what you were paying that man to do on my front porch yesterday. I held the audio recorder directly up to the microphone. I pressed the play button. A burst of static crackled through the massive sound system, followed by the crisp sound of the breeze at the farmhouse. And then Rachel's own voice filled the silent ballroom. He is completely gone, Mrs. Lawson. The voice of the corrupt neurologist echoed over the speakers. The dementia diagnosis is signed and official. He is legally incapacitated as of this moment. Then came Rachel's voice, sharp and cold. And the facility. Is everything arranged? Everything is confirmed, the doctor replied. With this signed diagnosis and your power of attorney, you have full medical proxy. You can commit him to the Sunset Pines facility by Friday morning. They have a secured memory care ward. He will not be allowed any outside contact without your explicit permission. Excellent, Rachel's recorded voice said smoothly. The balance will be wired to your offshore account tonight. I pressed the stop button. The recorded voices vanished, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. Every person in the grand ballroom was staring at Rachel with unmasked horror and disgust. The wealthy elite, the corporate journalists, the shareholders who had admired her beauty moments before, now looked at her as if she were a monster. Rachel stumbled backward, covering her face. She let out a wretched sob. Her monstrous betrayal had just been broadcast to the entire world. You sold your own father for a lithium deposit, I told her. My voice carried no rage, only a cold, crushing finality. You did not just want my money. You wanted to erase my freedom. You paid a corrupt doctor to forge a medical diagnosis so you could throw me into a locked asylum for the rest of my natural life. You were willing to let me rot in a padded cell just so your husband could strip mine your childhood home. Dad, I am sorry, she wailed, falling to her knees next to Victor. I am so sorry. Sorry does not erase what you did, I replied steadily. I spent my entire life trying to build a safe world for you. I stepped down from the company I loved to ensure your husband had a prestigious career. And in return, you tried to steal my life. You chose greed over family. You chose the illusion of wealth over the father who raised you. Therefore, you will live with the total consequence of your choice. I looked down at her shaking figure. I felt an ache in my chest, but I knew I could not falter. You are no longer a Caldwell. I stated the finality of my words, striking like a hammer. You have severed the bond between us completely and permanently. Do not ever approach my farm again. If you step foot on my property, I will have you arrested for criminal trespassing. We are entirely finished. Rachel collapsed onto the stage, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. Victor remained frozen beside her, staring blankly at the floor. He was a ruined man, his empire dismantled in minutes. As I finished my sentence, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the grand ballroom suddenly swung wide open. A team of stern-faced men and women wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow letters across their backs, marched into the room. It was the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Jonathan Reed had alerted them hours ago, providing the entire offshore financial audit I had extracted from Victor's hidden wall safe. The agents moved with swift precision. They marched straight down the center aisle, their presence bringing a harsh reality to the corporate gala. Two agents marched directly onto the stage. They hauled Victor Lawson up from his knees. He did not fight them. He did not say a word. He was completely numb. They pulled his arms behind his back and secured heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Across the room, another pair of federal agents intercepted Sarah Jenkins, the corrupt chief financial officer, just as she was trying to slip out a side exit. They placed her in handcuffs as well, reading her rights as she cried and tried to cover her face from the cameras. I stood quietly at the podium and watched the federal agents escort my son-in-law and his mistress out of the ballroom. The crowd of wealthy shareholders and executives watched the entire procession in stunned silence. The empire of lies Victor had meticulously built was now nothing more than a pile of rubble. He was going to spend the best years of his life sitting inside a federal prison cell, a fitting end for a man who tried to imprison an innocent man for a piece of dirt. I looked back down at Rachel. She remained on the stage utterly alone. She had lost her husband, her wealth, and her father. I turned off the microphone. I picked up my briefcase. I departed. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom closed softly behind me, muffling the chaotic aftermath of Victor's spectacular downfall and total public ruin. I walked through the luxurious hotel lobby and stepped out into the cool, crisp, and refreshing night air. My beat-up Chevy Silverado was still parked exactly where I had proudly left it, an unpolished symbol of hard work amidst a sea of fragile, superficial luxury. I climbed inside, started the roaring engine, and drove away from the flashing cameras and the shattered illusions of the corporate elite forever. My heart felt incredibly light. For the first time in 5 years, the heavy burden of my hidden legacy had been completely lifted from my weary, aging shoulders. The truth was finally out in the open for everyone to see. The following Monday morning, I officially took over the executive operations of Apex Innovations. I did not wear a custom-tailored suit to my first board meeting. I wore my familiar plaid flannel shirt and my scuffed steel-toed boots. The remaining board members who had foolishly empowered Victor sat around the polished mahogany table in absolute silence. They were terrified that I would fire every single one of them for their gross negligence and absolute failure to oversee the company's financial operations. I did not waste my time with vengeance. I had a company to rebuild from the ashes they had carelessly left behind. One of the board members, a slick, overpaid managing director named Arthur Peterson, attempted to break the suffocating silence. He offered a nervous, trembling smile and leaned forward, clasping his manicured hands. "Richard, sir, we are simply thrilled to have you back at the helm," Peterson stammered, attempting to rewrite history on the spot. "We always had our deep suspicions about Victor's aggressive tactics. We tried to push back against his restructuring plans, I assure you. We are entirely on your side." I stared at Peterson for a long, quiet moment, until his fake smile melted into a grimace of pure discomfort. "Do not insult my intelligence, Arthur," I replied, my voice dangerously low. "I have read the minutes of every single board meeting from the past 8 months. Not only did you fail to push back against Victor, but you personally seconded the motion to approve the fraudulent mass layoffs. You blindly rubber-stamped the destruction of thousands of families because you were promised a lucrative bonus from the Obsidian Holdings buyout." Peterson visibly shrank into his expensive leather chair, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. I looked around the room, making direct, unflinching eye contact with every single executive present. "None of you are getting fired today," I stated coldly. A collective, quiet sigh of relief washed over the table, but I immediately cut it off. "Because firing you would trigger your multi-million-dollar severance packages. Instead, every single one of your executive contracts is currently being heavily renegotiated by Jonathan Reed's legal team. Your bonuses are permanently revoked. Your stock options are frozen. You are all on strict zero-tolerance probation. You will spend the next year fixing the massive disaster you allowed to happen, and you will do it on a drastically reduced salary. If anyone objects to these new terms, you are welcome to tender your immediate resignation and walk out of this building with absolutely nothing. Not a single person in the room moved a muscle. They nodded meekly in silent submission. I stood at the head of the long table and issued my first official directive. I announced immediately to the corporate press that the 2,000 impending layoffs were permanently canceled. The manufacturing division was absolutely no longer for sale. Obsidian Holdings was dissolved entirely into the ether. A massive wave of profound relief swept through the factories and assembly lines across the state. Thousands of dedicated men and women who had spent their entire weekend fearing for their livelihoods returned to work on Monday with renewed hope. But I knew I could not run a multi-billion-dollar corporation from my tractor. I needed a leader who actually understood the blood, sweat, and tears required to build something real. I bypassed the polished executives and walked directly down to the main manufacturing floor. I found Michael Evans. He was a loyal, hard-working floor manager who had been with Apex Innovations for 25 years. He knew the names of his workers. He knew the complex machinery. He possessed the exact kind of rugged integrity that Victor completely lacked. I brought him up to the executive suite and officially promoted him to the position of acting chief executive officer. He wept quietly when I handed him the keys to the office. The company was finally back in the hands of the people who actually built it. Weeks later, I found myself back on my quiet 50-acre farm. The aggressive yellow excavators were completely gone, leaving only deep tire tracks in the dirt that the coming spring rains would eventually wash away entirely. The fraudulent medical papers were permanently shredded. The corrupted neurologist had been stripped of his medical license and was currently facing severe federal charges alongside Victor and the disgraced chief financial officer. My property was safe, firmly protected by an ironclad legal trust that no greedy hands could ever break. I sat alone on my wraparound wooden porch. The crisp morning air filled my lungs with a deep, comforting chill. I held a steaming ceramic mug of hot black coffee in my weathered hands. I looked out over the sprawling green tomato fields, watching the morning dew sparkle under the rising sun. The vast lithium deposit resting deep beneath the soil would stay exactly where it belonged. It would remain buried and completely undisturbed. Some things in this world are simply far more valuable than $100 million. I lost a daughter to the blinding poison of greed. Rachel had chosen her path, and she was now living in the cold, hollow isolation of her own terrible decisions. That painful reality would always ache somewhere deep inside my chest. But as I watched a flock of birds soar peacefully over the towering oak trees I had planted decades ago, I knew I had made the only right choice. I saved my soul, I protected my lifelong legacy, and I preserved the livelihoods of thousands of innocent families who depended on my company to survive. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the profound peace of a man who had faced the darkest shadows of betrayal and emerged entirely unbroken into the brilliant light of a brand new dawn. The farm was quiet again. The heavy machinery was gone, replaced by the gentle rustle of the wind moving through the tall grass. I was finally truly home. True wealth is not measured by the size of your bank account, the car you drive, or the titles you hold. It is measured by the integrity of your actions when you think no one is watching. Greed is a blinding poison that makes people sacrifice their most precious relationships for temporary gains. Never underestimate the quiet observation of those who live simply. Often the people who demand the least are the ones who hold the most power. Respect is earned through honesty, and betrayal, no matter how carefully hidden, will always find its way out into the bright light. Have you ever been underestimated or betrayed by someone you trusted with all your heart? How did you rise above it? Share your story in the comments below. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon for more powerful life stories today.